Vietnam, Lesson 3, Part 2. Here's Lyndon Johnson. The conflict in Vietnam. What does it look like? Why do Americans protest it? How was it fought? Election 1964. Democrats nominated Lyndon Johnson on that Great Society platform. He really uses the Gulf of Tonkin effectively as an event that's an example of communism spreading and having to defend against communism. He's concerned, though, again, that this is going to be a wider war, turn into a wider war. He wants to protect his Great Society program by keeping this war decision-making and development kind of amongst just a secretive few, and you see them there. I mentioned to you in the previous lesson. The Joint Chief of Staff, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was kind of concerned about them, felt that they were maybe a little bit too aggressive, but we are going to be pretty aggressive here as well. Things are going to escalate a lot. Top officials really aren't part of the decision-making process. Advisors, U.S. advisors do demand more involvement and support that are close to him involved with this. Some cabinet members will support escalation. Again, the domino theory is really continuing to be cited here in all of this. Prevent communism from spreading. We got to support Vietnam, support Vietnam, support Vietnam. We got to push back. The air war in Vietnam. Airstrikes are going to be preferred early on because it costs fewer U.S. lives, involves fewer people in the ground. But by 1967, amazingly, this is a very small country. More bombs are going to be dropped in Vietnam than the Allies dropped during all of World War II. You could look up pictures and images where vast areas of Vietnam, especially North Vietnam, look like a golf ball. Pockmarks everywhere. The Viet Cong, these are South Vietnamese guerrilla fighters, communist fighters supported by the Viet Minh in the north. 30,000 miles of tunnels. You can see how small they are. They're up and down the country, crisscrossing the country into the South Vietnam, into Laos, into Cambodia, and they live there. They have their supplies there. The idea is to hit, fight, attack, run to fight and live another day, drive the United States, and they did this to the French as well, crazy, and get them to want to just quit the war. Booby traps throughout, punji sticks in pits dug in the ground, covered by grass. They're going to prove to be more tenacious and more devoted to this than any of the Americans really are. The idea is just don't lose, all right? Just don't lose. If you don't lose, you win. If you hang on over time. And General Westmoreland here, who's going to be in charge of Vietnam, is going to always say, I need more troops. There is an attack on a base called Pleiku, and Lyndon Johnson orders some significant bombing by these B-52 bombs called Operation Rolling Thunder. It's the first bombing in North Vietnam. It's not going to stop for about 3 years, targeting bases, roads, railways, and of course the Ho Chi Minh Trail, trying to shut off all of these supplies going into the country, into South Vietnam, from North Vietnam, through these countries, through the jungles. Operation Rolling Thunder, escalation. Air war first, but more people are coming in significantly in 1965. The ground war, air and ground war, air war also involves this thing called napalm. It's heavily used in Vietnam, trying to flush out the fighters out of the jungle. It's basically gasoline. Agent Orange, as I mentioned, you can see the map of where it's spread here, is sprayed all over the country. This has caused significant numbers of birth defects for generations to come, decades to come afterward, in Vietnam and in Cambodia, Laos, as well as in the United States with Vietnam veterans. Initially, there's a lot of optimism in the war. There's public support for the war as well, but this is going to go away quickly with some events. Search and destroy missions is the tactic utilized here to go find Charlie were the communist Viet Cong forces. Go to a place, find out where they are, get information from the civilians, and attack them, destroy them. But they would leave the place, leave the area that they attacked, and then the Vietnamese forces would come back to that same area, and units would go into the same place multiple times. This was very demoralizing to American soldiers during Vietnam, and have to fight the battle over again with loss of life, for example. Super young compared to World War II and Vietnam. The average soldier just out of high school. Super young, inexperienced, really not fit for this. in going into these villages, trying to find out where the enemy was, interviewing basic, common, average, everyday citizens. Are you giving them supplies? Are you giving them support? Are you telling them where we are? Are you going to talk to them and tell them where we are, how long ago we were here, if they come and talk to you? Some of these places were supporting the enemy. They would burn down with these little Zippo lighters, burn down the homes of people. It really was one situation where these citizens were sometimes supporting the communists, sometimes not, but either way, they're caught in the middle between both forces. The Americans leave and the Viet Cong come in and say, what did you tell the Americans? Did you tell them what we were doing, where we were going? Are you supporting them? And some violent actions would be taken on them just to make sure everybody is keeping honest, so the common people really suffer on all this. The Viet Cong really know the terrain much better than the Americans. They do have peasant support. The Americans the United States conducts these pacification programs where they totally uproot villages and relocate them, kind of like in the Philippines, in the Philippine insurrection, kind of like in Cuba with the Spanish-American, before the Spanish-American War under General Weyler, to try and identify who's the enemy and who's not. And if you were outside these areas, these pacification areas, then it was kind of a free fire zone and you could shoot anybody basically on sight. And that, of course, was a big problem for how the war was viewed by the public later on. Fatalities going up continually with time as it goes on. This Tet Offensive is the turning point, 1968. We've got MLK assassinated. We've got Bobby Kennedy assassinated. There's riots in this year coming up later on in the election of 1968 in November about how the war is going. But up until this time, the pitch and the message was the war is being won. We're having success. It's just a little more time and we'll pacify things and things will get better. And then all of a sudden on this holiday for the Vietnamese people, there hadn't been necessarily a lot of fighting going on in previous holidays. All of a sudden, there erupts this massive attack throughout the country, in cities, in the country, all over the place against American military forces. And it's broadcast on television and it's shown on TV, and the American public takes a look at this, and the military even says, man, we're not in control, and the support for the war is going to start to plummet. Psychologically really destroys Americans and the United States. Not a military victory for them, but it does a lot of psychological damage, and public support is going to continue to spiral down with this particular event and into the election for LBJ. The father, you might say, of nightly news, national news, Walter Cronkite. You can read what he says here. You can go ahead and play this if you search it up, his report and viewpoint of Vietnam. He basically gave an opinion that it's time to negotiate and just get out. Winning is not the issue here. And this really didn't happen amongst the press and reporters. They didn't give their opinion. He does, and he was highly respected, and this sent a big, strong message against the war and just get out. There is a new left. Resistance starts significantly here in the youth of America. The new left is basically the young children of the fighters in the generation of World War II that fought World War II. University campuses see more protests. The Students for a Democratic Society, which was kind of a peaceful, nonviolent organization, starts to move away from that, sees the government as bureaucratic and basically being very oppressive. There are teach-ins on campus where people would just come to a meeting place and somebody would speak about what's going on in Vietnam to be a little more informed. And with every single day after the Tet Offensive in 1968, these particular groups, including SDS, religious groups, anti-nuclear groups, women's civil rights activists, start moving toward Vietnam as the message and the focus here to get out. 100,000 protesters in 1967 before Tet, right? And it gets even bigger than that later on. So the biggest cause of the protest is really going to be this whole draft issue. How does it work? It increases from 5,000 soldiers a month in 1965 to 50,000 in 1967. And the draft is something that's been going on since the end of World War II. It really hasn't gone away. And the one thing about the draft is that the poor, if you were poor, you were 2 times more likely to be drafted than a middle-class person. And that's because you could avoid the Vietnam War if you went to college. And so those who could afford college, the more the middle class, right? Suburbia, the familiar America we talked about with Harrington's book that supported the Great Society programs. um, they're not there. And it's poor people and minorities tend to be in larger portion of their population tends to be poor. They were 2 times more likely to be drafted going to war. And therefore, it kind of became, if you'd write this down, like the Civil War as well, it became a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And from here on, when political candidates run for office, they'll be looked at as, did you fight for the war, fight in the war, or did you not? Did you go to college? Were you there legitimately or not? This will be the case until 1970. Now, this is a time when, if you're 18 years old, you could not vote in presidential elections, but you could be drafted to go die in the war. A lot of irony here. That's going to be a big thing coming up later on, and a change is going to have to happen. Draft dodgers fled to Canada, burned their draft cards. There's protests all over the place with this. The press, more than any other war, had a free reign. The first time, really, had a free reign kind of in the war itself. They would jump on helicopters and fly out to fire zones, be at the front lines with soldiers, and they would report and record, and people would see this. The fighting and the attacks that were made on soldiers here, and how soldiers reacted to it, and this would turn public opinion against the war very significantly. Very much a similar effect in the civil rights movement. And it's after Tet that the media will become more critical of the war. The way in which the war was considered to be or measured in terms of success or failure were body counts. Literally, there were body counts kept and reported to the public in the newspapers as to number of people dead on their side versus our side, and this is how we're having success. And so this seemed like it was just a very inhumane war. The inhumanity of the war just really had a big impact on public opinion. And it pushes, as I mentioned before, the media to push against the war, and the public goes along with it. Increasingly over time, as the body counts go up and the devastation against the people of Vietnam goes up and increases, you see things like this. If you go to the wiki, you can see a clip from CBS News. Again, they've got reporters right out there in the thick of the firefight. There's in particular a few that are really significant. This one in particular, I advise you to watch to kind of get an idea of, right from a soldier's mouth, what they think of the war and how it's being fought and what's going on. In the United States Senate, there is established a series of committee hearings about the war and how it's being conducted. And largely it's a message of nothing but anti-war views. And this Senator William Fulbright is head of the Committee on Foreign Relations. And it's in 1966 and 67 that these hearings occur. The person you see here, you're going to read his document after this lesson is done, is a guy by the name of Kerry, and he will be a future Secretary of State under President Obama, but he is a veteran of the war, and you'll read his views on why the war is bad. But it basically comes down to, why it is that the war is being fought, how it's being fought, the support of the war for soldiers from leadership, that kind of thing. And we have increased sentiment against the war and the development of a group that we call the Doves, right? Peace, love. The Hawks defend the war as the president's policy on maintaining containment of communism. These particular people, you can kind of see it here in the image, tend to be the older generation. They're the World War II generation. They're the moms and dads of that particular time period. And the Doves argue that this conflict is really a conflict amongst the Vietnamese people. This is not our war. It's amongst them. We're sticking our nose into it. This is a place that's not vital to national security. It poses no direct threat to the United States. And the South Vietnamese government is not democratic. It has been oppressive in the past. It's oppressive. We shouldn't be a part of it and associated with it. And then comes along with it the way in which it's fought, the massive bombings on North Vietnam. Eventually, bombings are going to increase even more over time. Chemical weapons, chemicals being used as weapons against people in a way, not chemical weapons like World War I, but chemicals and the killing of people. The costs of the war just don't add up. And they tend to be the young, students, minorities. The same people are protesting in the civil rights movement. And so with this Tet event, things swing in a big direction. You can see where the public opinion significantly changes here. In particular, here's the big crossing point here where people are opposing the war, significantly increasing numbers. Lyndon Johnson's popularity just goes right in the basement. And with a guy by the name of Eugene McCarthy, a Minnesota politician, challenging him for the Democratic nomination, that's not very common that a sitting president gets challenged. Robert Kennedy having some success in the primaries, challenging him for the Democratic nomination. And with Tet, Johnson gets on national TV rather unexpectedly. It wasn't pre-announced that he's not seeking a renomination for the President of the United States. He's out. So we have new candidates in for 1968, and that'll lead us to Nixon in lesson 3. Do your left side review. Make a chart, make a graphic organizer of some sort. It's kind of up to you, but make sure you read through Martin Luther King and John Kerry on why they opposed the Vietnam War. Good day. Keep making the hay.